Everyone. Welcome back to Din and Daf. This is Elana Stein Hain. Today we're going to talk about something that is less of a philosophical concept and more really just trying to understand a legal concept. But of course, anytime you try to understand a legal concept in Halakha, you will come out of it with some sense of an idea about the world around you. So we'll meet somewhere between philosophy and law. The topic is davar hama'amid. Davar hama'amid, at least the example from Avodah Zarah, not the example from a sukkah, which is something that you lean your schach on, davar hama'amid, which is a different conversation. In the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, davar hama'amid is something that gives a food its form. So think the way that, I guess, rennet, you curdle milk with rennet. It's an enzyme, and you make cheese, right? Gelatin, for anybody who watches the Great British Bake Off, like me, sometimes they'll use some gelatin in order to create a firmer kind of cake or bake that they're trying to do. So things that give food their form, that give the final recipe its form. Davar Ma'amid comes up in a mishnah in Avodah Zarah that's found on Daf Kaftet Amud Bet 29b, where we find out that the reason why Jews are not permitted to eat cheese made by non-Jews is because the assumption is that they're curdling the milk in the stomach of an animal that is an avela, meaning it wasn't slaughtered properly. In other words, the enzymes that are going to curdle that milk and turn it into cheese, the ma'amid, the thing that's going to turn it into from a liquid into a block of cheese, is something that is usur, forbidden to eat. Ma'amid. Now, of course, when you look in the Gemara on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph in Avodah Zarah 35a, what you find is there are lots of reasons why we suggest maybe Jews are not allowed to eat the cheese made by non-Jews, including, do we think that they put pork, kind of a film of pork on it? Do we think that lots of different things? But what I want to do is I want to understand the halacha of Mamid. And the reason why I ask this question is because we actually specifically have an example in Sifrut Chazal, in rabbinic literature, of another case of the stomach of an animal being used to curdle milk and turn it into cheese. Only that case is not the stomach of a non-kosher animal because it's a nevela, because it wasn't slaughtered. That case is the stomach of a kosher animal. And our question is, wait a second, do we have a milk and meat problem? So if we think that anytime something gives form to the food, that it doesn't matter how little or how much of the item there is, then in that case too, we should say, well, actually, we do have a milk and meat problem here. Because it seems the same way putting something in the stomach of putting milk in the stomach of a nevela, a non-slaughtered, thus non-kosher animal, would be a problem of the ma'amid, the form creator, even if there's very little of it. Shouldn't it be the same here? Even if there's very little meat, meaning it's just the lining of the stomach and the enzymes from it, and it's actually way overwhelmed by the amount of milk that's there. Do we still say that we have a milk and meat problem? Or do we say what we generally say? When you have a mixture of two different types, if it's 60 to 1, after the fact, we'll say, batel be-shishim. It is nullified. So that's really my issue. My issue really is why, in the case of milk and meat, do we actually say, nah, this ma'amid stuff, we're not concerned about it. We actually still hold the bittul be-shishim rule. Whereas in the case of the non-kosher stomach, because it's a nevela, we're concerned about mamid. So even if there's 60 more, the ratio of milk to stomach lining is 60 to 1, or even more than that, we still say what gives it form is a problem. So let's take a look together at some of the Makorot, at some of the sources. Okay? So first of all, we have our mishnah in Avodah Zarah, very clear. Sha'al, oh, actually, let me make this look nicer for you. Let's make this look nicer for you. Here we go. Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael, Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael to Rabbi Yoshua, K'shayu mahalchin b'derech. Rabbi Yishmael asks Rabbi Yoshua when they're walking, Amar lo mipnei ma asru gvinot ovdei kochavim. Why are, in this case, pagan cheeses not allowed? Amar lo, meaning cheese made by pagans, without the oversight of a Jew. Amar lo mipnei shema'amidin oto b'keva shel nevela. Because they curdle it in the stomach lining of a nevela, of an unslaughtered animal. And of course, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, in addition to providing us with other reasons why we might say we're not allowed to eat the cheese in that time of pagans and today cheese made by non-Jews without Jews involved in overseeing that process. And it's kevan to okme kamokim. Why is it? Because this thing is giving it form. Chashiv le kimandi ite li isura be'ene. We think of it as it's as if you actually see the prohibited item, be'en, you actually see it. We don't say that a 60 to 1 ratio allows us to eat after the fact if you can still see that one thing, if it's still right there extant in front of your face. And essentially what the Gemara is suggesting is that the reason why a ma'amid, even if it's less than a 60th of everything that's there, is a problem, is because it's giving it the form. So you always kind of know its impact is always felt, right? Why do we say 60 to 1 is okay? Because you don't taste it anymore, right? There's no ta'am, there's no taste of it anymore. Here, the Gemara says it's not just that it's like there's a taste, it's like it's right there in front of you because it's the thing that gave this whole block of cheese its form. Now, I do want to clarify for all of us, people do not curdle cheeses generally, from what I understand, in stomachs anymore. We still have the prohibition of gvinat akum. We'll go back to why that is a little bit later. But of course, the Mishnah in Chulin doesn't seem bothered by the Ma'amid problem. In fact, the Mishnah in Chulin says in Parakhet, the 8th chapter, Hama'amid be'or shel keva kshera, im yesh benotein tam, harezo asura. One who curdles milk into cheese in the skin, in the lining of a stomach of a kosher animal, also a kosher animal that was shechted, we mean, that was slaughtered, only if the taste of the stomach lining, which is meat, can actually be tasted in the milk, i.e., it's not a ratio of 60 to 1 or more than that, then only then is this a problem of milk and meat. So everybody scrambles to try to figure out the difference. Why in the milk and meat case are we looking at 60 to 1 and nitinat ta'am, the taste being what matters, whereas in the case of putting something, curdling that same milk in something that is asur on its own, something that is prohibited on its own, we would say, no, 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 even if there's very little and the ratio is more than 60 to 1, because you see the form of it, it's as though you see the object itself. So the truth is, I gave away a little bit of the store because the Rambam really does say the difference between them is simple. Asur laha'amid hagvina ba'or hakiva shel shkuta. You're not supposed to curdle cheese, meaning curdle milk into cheese, in the stomach of a of a slaughtered, even a slaughtered animal. But ve'im ha'amid, but if you did to'emet hagvina, you have somebody who's not Jewish, you ask them to taste the cheese. Im yesh batam basar asura, if they can taste the meat in it, it's prohibited. Ve'im lav muteret, and if not, it's okay. Mipnei shehama'amid davar hamutarhu. Why? Because the ingredient that is giving form to this food, namely the stomach lining of a slaughtered animal, is itself permitted. Shekevat shchutahi, because it's the stomach of a slaughtered kosher animal. Ve'ein kan ella iser basar b'chalav. And so what you're looking at is that the concern here is milk and meat. And when we talk about milk and meat, sheshiro benotein tam, with milk and meat, after the fact, it's the 60-to-1 ratio because it's only if the taste is felt, if it can still be tasted. Aval, but on the other hand, hama'amid be'or kivat nevela utrefa, ubehemat me'ah. If somebody were to curdle milk in the stomach lining of a non-slaughtered animal, or an animal that was going to die of its own causes because it was it had a mortal wound, which would also make it not kosher, or a non-kosher animal. In that case, hoil v'hama'amid davar ha'aser bifnei atzmo, because the item, the ingredient that is causing the form of the cheese is itself asur, is itself prohibited. That's why ne'esra hagvina, the cheese becomes prohibited, mishum nevela, because it itself becomes considered like an animal that wasn't slaughtered. Lo mishum basar b'chalav, it has nothing to do with milk and meat. Umipnei chashash zeh, and because of this, asru gvinat akum kimoshe be'arnu, they outlawed eating cheese made by non-Jews without Jews overseeing what's going on. The difference is when the object that creates the form is itself asur, prohibited, I don't care what the ratio is, it's a problem. Whereas when the object itself is fine, it's just that the combination of the two, like the case of the stomach lining of a kosher animal, it's just the combination that's a problem. We're actually going with the combination that we always go with for basar b'chalav. So that's the Rambam. And in fact, the Rambam is quite ikvi. He's quite consistent. He also talks elsewhere in the laws of forbidden foods, Hilchot Ma'achalot Asurot, in chapter 16. He talks elsewhere about other kinds of forbidden rennet. For example, if you used the syrup of an orla fruit, meaning a fruit that is in its first 3 years of growth when you're not allowed to eat it, or presumably in its, well, actually, we're going to leave that. Let's go with first 3 years of growth. If you use that as the rennet, likewise, doesn't matter what the ratio is because you're starting with a ma'amid, something that creates the form that is asur. It is a problem in and of itself, right? So first of all, I'm not going to give you some grand philosophy, but what I am going to say is I think it is quite interesting that we are treating a non-kosher base versus a mixture that becomes non-kosher differently from each other. And I think in general, these are questions that come up in kashrut. How much do we treat the problem of basar b'chalav, milk and meat, the same way as we treat the problem of a non-kosher item that's in there? So that's one approach to the issue. Another approach to the issue is taken by the Baalei HaTosfot, by the Tosafists. In number 7, we have Ve'im Tomar, and if you say, and this is also relating to our Gemara on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, Avodah Zarah 35a, Ve'im Tomar my irya nevela, if you say, why are we using the example of an unslaughtered animal and using the rennet of the enzymes of that stomach lining. Afilu shchuta nami asura mishum basar b'chalav. Shouldn't you also likewise give an example of trying to use the enzymes of a kosher slaughtered animal to curdle cheese? Because that should also be a problem because of milk and meat, and it should similarly be a problem regardless of ratio. V'yesh lomar, he says, here's an answer. Didafka nakat nevela, da'az ikaba isura deoraita. It says, actually, the nevela example, the example of an unslaughtered animal, is a much stronger example because it is a biblical prohibition. It is biblically prohibited. Aval bishchuta, but if you were curdling cheese in a stomach, a meat stomach of a slaughtered animal, mishum basar b'chalav leka isura deoraita. That wouldn't be a biblical prohibition. Titzonein bitzonein hu, because they're cold, right? This is not derech bishul. This is not the way of cooking. They are cold. So there's a rabbinic prohibition, but we're not going to throw away ratios because of a rabbinic prohibition, okay? But in a biblical prohibition, seems that we would, right? V'afal gav okume kamokim, even though it's true that stomach lining of that kosher slaughtered animal is what's giving the cheese its form, still eno asur elamid rabbanan, it's only rabbinically prohibited. So a difference between the two examples is one is deoraita and one is derabanan, right? This, I think, is likewise interesting. We often see when we talk about kashrut in sort of a simplistic way of can't do this, can't do that, can't do this, can't do that. Sometimes we forget about the ramifications that actually obtain when something is asur min haTorah versus asur midrabanan. When something is asur only is only asur biblically when it's derech bishul, when it actually is cooked together, there's actually heat, versus something is considered asur either already on its own or even if it's not. Now, an interesting question might come up here, which is what if you added some salt into the equation? Is it possible that we might say if you salted this, then it would be somewhat derech bishul, a way of cooking, because sometimes we say salting is similar to cooking, right? But that already starts to make you think. But different from the Rambam, it's not about what is the mixture made up of. It's actually about what is the level of prohibition. A third approach is offered by the Maggid Mishnah, which I actually think is somewhat of a it's an approach that in a way is I don't want to say it's ignoring the problem of Ma'amid altogether, but it's kind of telling you why we would want to apply a stricter standard, specifically when we're talking about Gvinat Akum, specifically when we're talking about cheese that is made uh, under non-Jewish ownership by non-Jews without any Jewish oversight. Okay, so the Maggid Mishnah, commenting on the Rambam, says, Umikol Makom, and he's commenting where the Rambam talks about the Ma'amid problem. ומכל מקום יש מן המפרשים ז"ל שפירשו שאין הולכין באיסורן אלו של עכו"ם אחר נתינת טעם. It says there are some commentaries who say the reason, the onus is not on proving why we don't follow the law of ma'amid in the case of milk and meat, meaning you had a kosher meat stomach lining and you curdled milk in it. The onus is the opposite. The default is you should say 60-to-1 ratio makes all the difference. Why are we stricter when it comes to gvinat akum? Why do we say that so long as it's mamid, we are going to be strict and not let you eat it, even if there's a 60-to-1 permissible to prohibited ratio? And so he says, right, they didn't want to be. They didn't want to be when it comes to the prohibitions of eating food prepared by non-Jews. They didn't want to follow the law of netinat ta'am, that it's all about ratio because it's all about taste. Why shechachamim ratzu laharchik me'ochleihem, right? Or laharchik ma'achalehem, probably the sages wanted to actually keep us from eating their foods, right? We want to be more machmir, we want to be more um, strict because we don't want to be eating their foods. V'lo amru sheyeh chashash b'notein tam b'dafka. And so they didn't say, look, the only way we're worried that maybe something problematic is in there is if somebody, can taste something. No, we want to be more strict about it to keep you away from essentially fraternizing overly with people who are not of the same faith, out of a worry of what might come out of that. And he says, um, Bizedat Haramban, the Harashba. He thinks that this is what the Ramban and the Rashba think, and then goes on to say that maybe for them, some of the other reasons for given on Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph on 35a, some of the other reasons given for Gvinat Akum for that prohibition might also be live, and Ma'amid might not be all of it, right? There's a lot more. So I think this approach is very interesting also because it asks you, okay, now that someone's explained to me the logic of Ma'amid, like, wait, it's giving it its whole form. Of course you should care that it's in there, even though you can't, I don't know, taste it or the ratio, there's so much more, cheese to the enzyme or to the skin of, I should say, to the skin of the stomach, right? Why are we assuming that that is the logic and that the basar b'chalav logic is, I don't know, um, is the outlier? No, untrue. This logic of Mamid is created in order to expand our isurim when it comes to eating certain things because we're trying to keep Jews endogamous, marrying each other. Okay? So, really interesting. Third approach, very different approach from both the Rambam, saying it's about whether the item that's ma'amid is usser in and of itself. Very different from the Tosfot, saying, well, one example is a biblical prohibition, and so we're more machmir on it, and the other example is a rabbinic prohibition. And third, this kind of, well, what is the purpose of trying to keep people from eating this? Okay. I want to do one more thing that I think adds a bit to our sense of what this whole Mamid business is. Now, first of all, I gave you on the source sheet for people who want to look, you can find that and I mentioned this earlier in the year, that in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam does tell us that even if non-Jews make cheese that's of completely fine kosher rennet, we still can't eat it, right? I gave you that Rambam because I think it does open us to the possibility that actually not eating the cheese made by non-Jews is not just about Mamid, right? But it's actually about a social endgame of trying to keep us Jewishly um, committed, right? Both in terms of marriage and also in terms of how we practice. But there's also a little bit beneath the surface that I gave you in the Gemara in Beitza on Daf Hey Amud Aleph, 5a in Beitza, which is there's also something called, a davar shebeminyan. A davar shebeminyan is something that was voted on, and in order to be unvoted or in order to be nullified, it needs minyan acher lahatiro. It needs another vote in order to nullify it. And it's possible that the reason why we still keep the prohibition of cheese made by non-Jews, even though it's generally not made with non-kosher rennet, it's possible that it's not just because the whole point of it was to keep Jews and non-Jews separate. It's also possible that it's something that's one of these things that's considered it was put into practice, and in order to put it out of practice, you need the right people to be able to vote on it. Now, that's a really interesting topic in and of itself. Maybe some other day we'll do that, but I left it on this sheet for you. But the last thing I want to do is I want to do something that shows up in other situations as well, but I love that it shows up in Mamid, which is Mamid has an asterisk next to it. The asterisk is not just, oh, well, in the case of milk and meat, we're not worried about Mamid. It has another asterisk, and the asterisk is Ze v'ze gorim. Ze v'ze gorim is when something is made from two, um, it has two effectuating, what's the word I'm thinking of? I'm trying to think of the word like mania, what makes it happen. But it's the wrong word. I can't think of the right word. Let's read the Shulchan Aruch and maybe the right word will come. So Shulchan Aruch says in Yoredea 87, Pei Zayin, Im hamid gvina b'or kiva kshera, yesh batam basar asura v'im lav muteret. Right? If you put, if you curdle cheese in the stomach lining of a kosher animal, only if the meat can be tasted is that cheese prohibited. And if not, it is allowed. Aval המעמיד באור קיבת נבלה וטרפה ובהמה טמאה אוסר בכל שהוא. But if you do that same thing and you curdle cheese in the stomach lining of an animal that's not slaughtered, or an animal that had a mortal wound, or an animal, and I don't just mean mortal wound externally, right? Or an animal, right? It could have a punctured lung, all those kinds of things, or an animal that's not kosher, no matter how much or little you have of the Ma'amid, it makes the whole thing usher, prohibited from eating. Okay? And the Rambam then, and the Rama, excuse me, Rav Moshe Isserlis, then seems to quote um, uh, similar to the Rambam, Mishum de davar asur ba'atzmo, right? He says because the thing itself, right, is asur uma'amid, and it's what's giving the form. But what I'm interested in is the next line. It says v'dafka shelo haya sham ma'amid echad rak ha'isr. This is only the case where there was only one ingredient that was giving the form to the food item. Aval, im hayasham gamkin ma'amid heter, if there was also another ingredient that was giving form to the item. So I'll give you an example. You're using the stomach lining of a non-kosher animal, the enzymes in there, and you're also using some plant or flower enzyme that's totally kosher and totally fine. And you're using both of them to curdle the cheese. We say that that is a case of zeh v'zeh gorim. It's a case of both this and that cause it. That's the word I was looking for, cause, right? The cause is both the non-kosher stomach of the animal, but there's also the cause of the um, whatever the enzymes are from the flour that you're using, right, to do the curdling, and therefore, umutter, then it would be allowed im ika samech neged ha'isr, if there was a ratio of 60-1. So I think this is really, really interesting because essentially what it's saying is if you have a case of zeh v'zeh gorim, what you now have turned this into is almost like a basar b'chalav case. Not that it's literally milk and meat, but you've changed the nature of what we're looking at here. Instead of the mamid itself being the star of the show, and the problem with it is that it's usser, you've now added another star of the show, a ma'amid that is totally mutter, and you've changed the nature of what's going on here. Maybe we'll get to the concept of zevazeh gorim in a more serious way in a few weeks because it actually does show up in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Memchet Amud Bet 48b when talking about what you are or are not allowed to do near an Asherah, near an Avodah Zarah, an idol, a worshipped tree, a tree planted to be worshipped as Avodah Zarah. Are you allowed to do things where its shade will be used or its leaves will be used? What if its leaves will fall off and be fertilizer for whatever goes down underneath, is planted underneath it, but so will the soil and what's going on in the soil. Maybe you'll have a zev, gorim, and we have a machloket about whether that is makes it more allowed or not, but maybe we'll get to that in a few weeks. But suffice it to say, I hope that we have a deeper understanding of what is going on with this ma'amid business. Look forward to next time.